The dust swirled around Jake Morrison's boots as he found himself surrounded by 12 Apache warriors on horseback. Their painted faces showed no mercy, and their arrows were aimed directly at his heart. The year was 1887, and Jake had been tracking stolen cattle through the harsh Arizona territory when he stumbled into Apache lands. Jake raised his hands slowly, his weathered face calm despite the danger. He had spent 15 years as a cowboy, working ranches from Texas to California, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The Apache warriors spoke in their native tongue, their voices sharp and commanding. Jake understood enough to know they were deciding whether to kill him on the spot or take him back to their camp. The leader of the group, a tall warrior with intricate blue war paint across his cheeks, rode closer to Jake. His dark eyes studied the cowboy intensely, looking for any sign of fear or deception. Jake met his gaze steadily, knowing that showing weakness would mean certain death. The warrior spoke a single word in Apache, and the others lowered their weapons slightly. They bound Jake's hands with rawhide rope and forced him to walk behind their horses as they made their way through the rocky canyon. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Jake's throat grew dry with each step. He had heard stories about what happened to white men who were captured by Apache tribes, and none of those stories ended well. As they traveled deeper into the mountains, Jake noticed the landscape changing around him. The red rocks gave way to hidden valleys filled with green grass and clear streams. This was Apache country, a place few white men had ever seen and lived to tell about it. The warriors seemed to relax slightly as they entered their territory, but their watchful eyes never left their prisoner. After several hours of walking, they reached the Apache camp. Jake was amazed by what he saw. Dozens of wickiups, traditional dome-shaped dwellings made of branches and grass, were scattered throughout a beautiful valley. Women and children stopped their daily activities to stare at the captured cowboy. Some of the children had never seen a white man before, and they whispered to each other in curiosity and fear. The warriors led Jake to the center of the camp, where a large fire pit was surrounded by logs arranged in a circle. This was clearly a place where important decisions were made. An elderly man with long gray hair and wearing an elaborate headdress approached them. His presence commanded immediate respect from everyone in the camp. This was Chief Running Bear, the leader of this Apache band. Chief Running Bear walked slowly around Jake, examining him like a hunter would study his prey. The chief's weathered hands bore the scars of countless battles, and his eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen both the best and worst of humanity. He spoke to the warrior who had captured Jake, listening carefully to the report of how and where the cowboy had been found. Jake stood as tall as he could, trying to maintain his dignity despite being bound and surrounded by people who considered him their enemy. He had always prided himself on being fair and honest in his dealings with everyone, including the few Native Americans he had encountered in his travels. But he knew that didn't matter now. To these people, he represented everything they had lost, and everyone who had wronged them. The chief raised his hand, and the entire camp fell silent. In broken English mixed with Apache words, he began to speak. "White man," he said, his voice deep and authoritative, "you come to our sacred hunting grounds. You follow the path of our ancestors without permission. You carry the mark of those who have taken our land and killed our people." Jake's heart sank as he realized the gravity of his situation. He had indeed been tracking cattle through what he now understood were sacred Apache lands. In his pursuit of the stolen livestock, he had unknowingly violated one of their most important taboos. The punishment for such an offense was traditionally death. "I meant no disrespect, Chief," Jake said, his voice steady despite his fear. "I was only following stolen cattle that belonged to my employer. I had no knowledge that these were your sacred grounds." Chief Running Bear studied Jake's face carefully, searching for any sign of deception. The Apache people were skilled at reading human nature, and the chief had survived many years by being able to distinguish between honest men and liars. Something in Jake's eyes gave the chief pause. The chief turned to address his people in Apache, his words flowing like water over stones. Jake couldn't understand the language, but he could tell from the reactions of the crowd that the chief was explaining the situation and asking for their input. Some of the warriors nodded gravely, while others shook their heads in disagreement. An old woman stepped forward from the crowd. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. She was the camp's medicine woman, and her words carried great weight in all important decisions. She spoke quietly to the chief, gesturing toward Jake several times during their conversation. As the discussion continued, Jake noticed a young woman standing near the edge of the crowd. She was beautiful in a way that took his breath away, with long black hair that shone like silk in the sunlight and dark eyes that seemed to hold all the mysteries of the desert. Unlike the others, she wasn't looking at him with hatred or fear. Instead, her expression was one of curiosity and something else he couldn't quite identify. This was Ayanna, the chief's daughter, though Jake didn't know it at the time. She had been educated in both Apache traditions and the ways of the white world, having spent 2 years at a mission school before returning to her people. She understood better than most the complex relationship between her people and the expanding world of white settlers and cowboys. Chief Running Bear called for silence once again. "Cowboy," he said, "our laws are clear about those who trespass on sacred ground, but our justice is also fair. You will face trial according to our customs. 3 days from now, when the sun reaches its highest point, you will stand before our tribal council. They will decide your fate." Jake felt a mixture of relief and dread. He was grateful for the chance to defend himself, but he knew very little about Apache justice. Would he be able to explain his actions in a way they would understand? Did he have any hope of leaving this valley alive? The chief gestured to 2 warriors who stepped forward to escort Jake to his temporary prison. They led him to a small wickiup on the outskirts of the camp, where his hands were untied, but his ankles were bound with leather rope. A guard was posted outside, ensuring he couldn't escape. As night fell over the valley, Jake lay on the hard ground and stared up at the stars through the opening in his shelter. He thought about his life, his family back in Texas, and the choices that had brought him to this remote place. He had always believed in treating people fairly, regardless of their race or background. Now he would find out if that belief would be enough to save his life. The sound of footsteps outside his shelter interrupted his thoughts. The guard spoke quietly to someone, and then Jake heard a soft voice asking permission to enter. To his surprise, the young woman he had noticed earlier appeared at the entrance to his prison. "My name is Ayanna," she said in perfect English, much to Jake's amazement. "I am the daughter of Chief Running Bear. I have come to learn about the man who will face our justice in 3 days." Jake sat up respectfully, surprised by her direct approach and her command of his language. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm Jake Morrison. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me." Ayanna entered the shelter and sat cross-legged across from him, maintaining a proper distance while still being able to speak quietly. "Tell me about yourself, Jake Morrison. What kind of man are you? What do you believe in?" For the next hour, Jake found himself sharing stories of his life with this remarkable young woman. He told her about growing up poor in Texas, about learning to be a cowboy from an old Mexican vaquero who had taught him to respect all living things. He spoke of his dreams to one day own his own ranch and raise horses. Ayanna listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed her intelligence and wisdom. She told him about her own education and her struggles to balance the traditional ways of her people with the changing world around them. As they talked, Jake began to understand the complex situation facing the Apache people. Your trial will not be easy, Ayanna warned him as she prepared to leave. Many of our people have suffered greatly at the hands of white settlers and soldiers. Some will see you as a symbol of all that pain and want revenge. I understand, Jake replied. All I can do is tell the truth and hope for justice. Ayanna paused at the entrance to the shelter, turning back to look at him one more time. The truth is important, she said quietly, but sometimes understanding is even more important. As she disappeared into the darkness, Jake felt a strange sense of hope. He didn't fully understand what she meant, but something in her words suggested that his fate wasn't completely sealed. He settled back onto the hard ground, knowing that the next 3 days would determine whether he lived or died. The following morning brought new challenges as Jake tried to prepare himself for the trial ahead. The guard brought him food and water, but communication was limited due to the language barrier. Jake spent his time observing the daily life of the camp through the small opening in his shelter. He watched children playing games that reminded him of his own childhood, women preparing meals and tending to their families, and warriors practicing with their weapons and horses. Despite everything he had heard about the Apache people being savage, what he saw was a community much like any other, with people working together to survive and care for each other. On the second day, an unexpected visitor arrived at Jake's shelter. It was the old medicine woman who had spoken to the chief on the day of his capture. She entered without ceremony and began examining Jake with the same intensity a doctor might show a patient. She looked into his eyes, felt his pulse, and even smelled his breath. Jake submitted to this strange examination without protest, sensing that resistance would only make his situation worse. After several minutes, the medicine woman nodded to herself and spoke a few words in Apache before leaving as quietly as she had come. That evening, Ayanna returned for another conversation. This time, she brought a small pot of herbal tea and some traditional Apache food. Grandmother Nalnish says you have an honest spirit, she explained as she served the simple meal. Her approval carries much weight with the tribal council. I'm grateful for any help I can get, Jake replied, genuinely touched by the kindness he was being shown despite his situation. Can you tell me what to expect at the trial tomorrow? Ayanna explained the process as best she could. The tribal council consisted of the chief, several elder warriors, and the medicine woman. They would hear evidence about Jake's trespassing, listen to his defense, and then deliberate on his punishment. The possible outcomes ranged from immediate death to banishment from Apache lands forever. There is one other possibility, Ayanna said, her voice becoming even quieter. In rare cases, when the council believes someone truly understands our ways and respects our people, they might offer adoption into the tribe. But this has not happened with a white man in many years. Jake felt his heart racing at this possibility, though he tried not to get his hopes up too high. What would I need to do to prove my understanding and respect? That, Ayanna said with a slight smile, is something only you can determine. The truth of a man's heart cannot be taught or practiced. It must be revealed through his words and actions. As the third day dawned, Jake knew his time had come. The guard untied his ankle bindings and led him to the center of the camp, where the entire tribe had gathered in a large circle around the council fire. The atmosphere was solemn and charged with tension. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley floor as the entire Apache tribe gathered for Jake Morrison's trial. Men, women, and children formed a large circle around the central fire pit, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity, anger, and solemn respect for their ancient justice system. Jake stood in the center, his hands still bound, trying to maintain his composure despite the gravity of the situation. Chief Running Bear took his place on a raised section of ground, flanked by the tribal council members. The medicine woman, Grandmother Nalnish, sat to his right, her weathered hands folded in her lap and her sharp eyes fixed on Jake. To the chief's left sat 3 elder warriors, their faces marked by years of battle and hardship. Each wore traditional ceremonial dress for this important occasion. The chief raised his staff, a carved piece of oak adorned with eagle feathers and turquoise stones, and the crowd fell into complete silence. Even the children stopped their whispered conversations and watched with wide eyes as their leader began the formal proceedings. "We gather today to judge this white man who has violated our sacred hunting grounds," Chief Running Bear announced in Apache, his voice carrying clearly across the valley. One of the elders then repeated the statement in broken English so Jake could understand the charges against him. "Jake Morrison," the chief continued, switching to English, "you stand accused of trespassing on the sacred grounds of our ancestors, where our people have hunted for generations beyond memory. You followed the deer paths that lead to our most holy places, carrying with you the weapons and intentions of those who would take what is ours. How do you answer these charges?" Jake took a deep breath, knowing that his life hung on the words he was about to speak. He had spent the past 3 days thinking about what he would say, but now, facing the assembled tribe, he realized that prepared speeches would not be enough. He needed to speak from his heart. "Chief Running Bear, honored council members, and people of this tribe," Jake began, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "I do not deny that I was on your lands without permission. I followed cattle tracks through your hunting grounds because I was doing my job, trying to recover stolen animals for my employer. But I now understand that my ignorance of your customs does not excuse my actions." He paused, looking around at the faces in the crowd. Some showed hostility, others curiosity, and a few seemed to be listening with genuine interest in what he had to say. "I have spent 3 days in your camp," Jake continued, "and I have seen something that challenges everything I thought I knew about your people. I was raised hearing stories that painted you as savage enemies of civilization. But what I have witnessed here is a community built on respect, tradition, and care for one another. Your children are well-fed and happy. Your elders are honored and cared for. Your warriors are brave, but also wise." A murmur went through the crowd at these words. It was rare to hear such observations from a white man, and several of the Apache people exchanged surprised glances. "I cannot undo my trespass," Jake said, his voice growing stronger. "But I can promise you this. If you spare my life, I will carry the truth of what I have seen here back to my people. I will tell them that the Apache are not the savages they believe you to be, but a proud people defending their home and their way of life." Chief Running Bear studied Jake's face intently, searching for any sign of deception. The chief had heard many white men make promises when their lives were in danger, only to break those promises the moment they were safe. But something in Jake's manner suggested sincerity. "You speak of truth," the chief said. "But how do we know your words are not just the desperate lies of a man facing death? Many before you have promised friendship and understanding, only to return with soldiers and guns." Jake thought carefully before answering. "Chief, I understand your skepticism. I have no proof to offer except my word and my actions. But I can tell you this. I have never broken a promise in my life, and I would rather die than start now." One of the elder warriors, a man with a deep scar across his left cheek, stood up and spoke rapidly in Apache. His tone was harsh and angry, and Jake could tell from the reactions of the crowd that the man was arguing for severe punishment. When he finished speaking, several other voices joined in, creating a heated discussion that Jake couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. The medicine woman, Grandmother Nalnish, raised her hand for silence. When the crowd quieted, she spoke in a voice that was soft, but carried clearly to every corner of the gathering. She spoke entirely in Apache, but Jake noticed that her words seemed to calm some of the anger in the crowd. Ayana, who had been standing with the other young women near the edge of the circle, stepped forward slightly. Jake could see the internal struggle on her face as she seemed to be debating whether to speak. Finally, she took another step toward the center of the circle. "My father!" she said in Apache, then switched to English so Jake could understand. I ask permission to speak on behalf of this man. A shocked silence fell over the gathering. It was unusual for a woman, even the chief's daughter, to speak during a formal tribal council, and almost unheard of for someone to speak on behalf of an accused trespasser. Chief Running Bear's expression showed both surprise and displeasure at his daughter's request. Ayanna, he said sternly, this is not a place for you. Return to your position and let the council continue its work. But Ayanna stood her ground. Something Jake could see took enormous courage. Father, our traditions say that anyone who has observed the accused and can speak to their character may address the council. I have spoken with this man at length over the past 2 days. I have learned about his heart and his intentions. The crowd began murmuring again, some supporting Ayanna's right to speak and others scandalized by her boldness. Chief Running Bear looked deeply troubled by his daughter's intervention, but he was also bound by the very traditions he was sworn to uphold. Very well, he said finally, though his tone made clear his displeasure. Speak quickly, and then return to your place. Ayanna walked closer to the center of the circle, near enough to Jake that he could see the determination in her dark eyes. Members of the council, she began, I have tested this man's character through conversation and observation. When I brought him food, he thanked me respectfully and asked about my welfare before his own. When I asked him about his life, he spoke honestly about both his successes and his failures. She paused, gathering her thoughts and courage for what she was about to say. Most importantly, when I told him about the suffering of our people, he listened with genuine sorrow and understanding. He did not try to justify the actions of other white men or make excuses. He simply listened and learned. The scarred warrior stood again, his voice angry as he challenged Ayanna's words. The daughter of our chief has been bewitched by the smooth words of this intruder. She speaks for him like a woman speaks for her husband. This is not right. Other voices joined in, and Jake could see that Ayanna's intervention was causing a deep division in the tribe. Some supported her right to speak, while others were outraged by what they saw as improper behavior for an unmarried woman. Chief Running Bear looked torn between his role as tribal leader and his love for his daughter. Finally, he spoke in a voice that carried both authority and sadness. Ayanna, you have spoken your piece. Now you must face the consequences of your words. By speaking for this man as you have, by tradition, you have bound your fate to his. Jake felt his blood turn to ice as he realized what this meant. By speaking in his defense, Ayanna had somehow linked her own life to his. If the council decided to execute him, she would face punishment as well. The thought that this brave young woman might suffer because of his situation was almost unbearable. Chief Running Bear, Jake called out, his voice filled with urgency. I cannot allow your daughter to face punishment for showing me kindness. If anyone must pay for my trespass, let it be me alone. The chief raised his hand for silence. The ritual has been performed according to our ancient ways. What is done cannot be undone. Ayanna has chosen to link her fate with yours through her words of support. Jake looked at Ayanna, who met his gaze with calm acceptance of what she had done. In her eyes he saw not fear, but a quiet strength that amazed him. She had known the consequences of speaking for him, yet she had chosen to do so anyway. Grandmother Nalnish rose slowly from her seat and walked toward the center of the circle. Her movement commanded immediate respect from everyone present, and even the most agitated voices fell silent as she approached Jake and Ayanna. The old medicine woman circled them both slowly, chanting softly in Apache while examining them with the same intensity she had shown when she visited Jake in his shelter. She stopped in front of Jake and placed her weathered hand on his chest, directly over his heart. For a long moment, she stood completely still, as if listening to something only she could hear. Then she turned to Ayanna and repeated the same gesture, placing her hand over the young woman's heart and standing in silent concentration. The entire tribe watched in fascination as their most revered spiritual leader performed this mysterious examination. Finally, Grandmother Nalnish stepped back and turned to face Chief Running Bear and the council. She spoke in Apache for several minutes, her words flowing like a river and her gestures emphasizing important points. Jake couldn't understand the language, but he could tell from the reactions of the crowd that her words were having a significant impact. When the medicine woman finished speaking, she returned to her seat, leaving Jake and Ayanna standing alone in the center of the circle. Chief Running Bear conferred quietly with the other council members, their discussion growing more intense as they debated the medicine woman's words. "What did she say?" Jake whispered to Ayanna. "She spoke of the old prophecies," Ayanna replied quietly. "She said that the spirits have shown her a vision of two hearts beating as one, bringing understanding between our peoples. She believes our fate is connected not just by my words today, but by something much greater." Jake felt a mixture of hope and confusion. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could see that Grandmother Nalnish's words had changed the atmosphere of the trial dramatically. The angry voices had died down, replaced by whispered conversations and thoughtful expressions. Chief Running Bear stood once again, his staff in his hand and his expression grave. "The council has heard all the evidence and testimony. We have listened to the words of our medicine woman and considered the ancient traditions that guide our decisions. The time has come for judgment." The valley fell into complete silence except for the crackling of the central fire and the distant cry of an eagle soaring overhead. Jake felt his heart pounding as he waited to learn his fate and that of the brave woman who had risked everything to defend him. "Jake Morrison," the chief began, "you have admitted your guilt in trespassing on our sacred lands. This crime traditionally carries the penalty of death. However, the circumstances of your case are unusual, and the council must consider all factors in reaching its decision." He paused, looking directly at his daughter before continuing. "Ayanna, daughter of my blood, you have chosen to bind your fate to this man through your testimony. This action shows either great wisdom or great foolishness, and only time will reveal which." The chief raised his staff higher, signaling that he was about to pronounce the council's judgment. "The medicine woman has spoken of visions and prophecies that suggest your joined fate serves a greater purpose. The council has decided to offer you both a choice rather than simply pronouncing sentence." Jake and Ayanna exchanged glances, both wondering what choice could possibly be offered in such a situation. "Jake Morrison," Chief Running Bear continued, "you may choose to die here today with honor, knowing that your death will serve as justice for your violation of our sacred places. If you choose this path, Ayanna will be banished from the tribe forever, but her life will be spared." Jake felt sick at the thought of Ayanna being punished for her kindness, but the chief wasn't finished speaking. "Or," the chief said, his voice growing stronger, "you may choose to undergo the trial of understanding. For one full season, you will live among us as one of our people. You will learn our ways, share our hardships, and prove whether your words of respect and friendship are genuine. At the end of that time, the tribe will decide your ultimate fate." Jake's mind raced as he considered the implications. A full season would mean 3 months living among the Apache, learning their customs and proving his worth. It would be dangerous, difficult, and there would be no guarantee of success. But it also offered hope. "And what of Ayanna?" Jake asked. "What would happen to her if I chose this trial?" Chief Running Bear's expression softened slightly as he looked at his daughter. "If you choose the trial of understanding, Ayanna will serve as your teacher and guide. Her fate will remain bound to yours until the trial is complete." Jake looked at Ayanna again, seeing in her eyes both hope and determination. He realized that this remarkable woman was willing to risk her future on the belief that he was worth saving. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. "I need no time to consider," Jake said firmly. "I choose the trial of understanding. I will prove to you and your people that my respect is genuine and my word can be trusted." A murmur of approval went through some parts of the crowd, while others remained skeptical. Chief Running Bear nodded solemnly, as if Jake's choice was exactly what he had expected. "Then let the trial begin," the chief announced. "For one season, Jake Morrison, you will live as one of us. You will learn our language, our customs, and our ways of surviving in this harsh land. You will share our work, our food, and our dangers. At the end of the season, if you have proven yourself worthy, you will be offered a choice that no white man has been offered before." Jake felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. He had been given a chance to live, to prove himself, and to truly understand the Apache way of life. But he also knew that the next 3 months would test him in ways he had never imagined possible. The next 3 months became the most challenging and transformative period of Jake Morrison's life. From the moment the trial of understanding began, every aspect of his existence was turned upside down. Gone were the familiar routines of cowboy life, replaced by the intricate customs and survival methods of the Apache people. Ayanna became his constant teacher and guide, a responsibility she took with serious dedication. Each morning before dawn, she would wake him and begin the day's lessons. First came the language, with Ayanna patiently repeating Apache words and phrases until Jake could pronounce them correctly. The language was unlike anything he had ever heard, with complex sounds and meanings that seemed to shift depending on context and tone. "Your tongue is too stiff," Ayanna would tell him with a gentle smile as he struggled with particularly difficult pronunciations. "The Apache language flows like water over stone. You must let it move naturally, not force it." Beyond language, Jake had to learn an entirely new way of living. The Apache relationship with the land was unlike anything he had experienced as a cowboy. Where he had been taught to dominate and control the environment, the Apache taught harmony and respect. Every plant, every animal, every stone had significance and purpose. Under the guidance of the tribal hunters, Jake learned to track game not just with his eyes, but with all his senses. He discovered how to read the wind, interpret the behavior of birds, and follow trails so faint they seemed invisible. The skills required patience and observation far beyond anything his cowboy training had demanded. "A good hunter becomes part of the land," explained Crow Feather, the tribe's master tracker. "You cannot take what you need if you remain separate from what provides it. The deer must accept you as part of their world before they will offer themselves to feed your family." Jake struggled with these concepts initially, his mind trained to think in terms of competition rather than cooperation. But gradually, through patient instruction and countless failed attempts, he began to understand the deeper wisdom behind Apache hunting methods. The physical challenges were equally demanding. Jake had considered himself tough after years of cowboy life, but Apache endurance and agility pushed him to his limits. He learned to climb seemingly impossible rock faces, to move silently through dense brush, and to travel long distances on foot without tiring. Young Apache warriors, initially skeptical of his presence, gradually began to include him in their training exercises. They taught him their fighting techniques, which relied more on speed and cunning than brute force. Jake discovered muscles he never knew he had as he learned to use traditional weapons like the bow, spear, and war club. "Strength without wisdom is useless," taught Grey Wolf, one of the elder warriors. "A wise fighter wins before the battle begins by understanding his enemy better than the enemy understands himself." As the weeks passed, Jake found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. His skin darkened from constant exposure to the desert sun, and his body became leaner and more flexible. But the changes went deeper than physical appearance. His thinking began to shift from the individual focus he had known as a cowboy to the community awareness that defined Apache life. He learned to consider how his actions affected not just himself, but the entire tribe. When hunting, he thought not only about making a clean kill, but about taking only what was needed and using every part of the animal. When gathering firewood, he selected branches carefully to avoid damaging trees that provided shelter for wildlife. Ayanna watched these changes with growing admiration. She had taken a tremendous risk by speaking for Jake during his trial, and she felt the weight of responsibility for his progress. As they spent more time together, she began to see qualities in him that impressed her beyond his willingness to learn. Jake showed genuine respect for Apache customs, even when he didn't fully understand them. He listened to the elders' stories with rapt attention, asked thoughtful questions about tribal history, and never spoke dismissively about beliefs that differed from his own upbringing. "You are beginning to see with Apache eyes," Ayanna told him one evening as they sat by the fire after a particularly successful hunting lesson. "Most white men look at our land and see only what they can take from it. You are learning to see what it can teach you." Their relationship deepened beyond teacher and student as they shared these intense experiences. Jake found himself drawn to Ayanna's intelligence, her courage in defending him, and her deep understanding of both worlds she had lived in. Ayanna, in turn, was moved by Jake's humility, his determination to prove himself worthy of the tribe's trust, and his genuine respect for her people. But their growing feelings for each other created a new complication. Apache customs regarding relationships were strict, and the fact that Jake was still officially an outsider on trial made any romantic attachment potentially dangerous for both of them. The trial period was not without its challenges and setbacks. There were moments when Jake's patience wore thin, when the constant scrutiny and unfamiliar demands seemed overwhelming. Some members of the tribe remained suspicious of his motives, watching for any sign that his commitment was false. One particularly difficult incident occurred during a sacred ceremony where Jake inadvertently violated a ritual taboo. His mistake was innocent, born of ignorance rather than disrespect, but it caused considerable offense among some tribal members. Several voices called for his immediate expulsion or punishment. Chief Running Bear addressed the situation with characteristic wisdom. "Learning requires mistakes," he told the assembled tribe. "A man who never fails is a man who never truly tries. The question is not whether he stumbled, but whether he learns from his stumbling." Jake was grateful for the chief's support, but he knew that such incidents damaged his standing with those who already doubted him. He redoubled his efforts to understand Apache customs, spending extra time with Grandmother Nalnish to learn about spiritual traditions and proper behaviors. The medicine woman became one of his strongest supporters as she observed his dedication to learning. "This one has a good heart," she told anyone who would listen. "The spirits whispered truth when they showed me the vision of two hearts beating as one." As the season progressed, Jake's skills improved dramatically. He could now communicate effectively in Apache, track game with confidence, and participate meaningfully in tribal activities. More importantly, he had gained the respect of many tribe members who had initially opposed his presence. The turning point came during a crisis that tested everything Jake had learned. A group of hostile Comanche raiders attacked a small Apache hunting party, killing 2 warriors and stealing valuable horses. The incident threatened to escalate into a larger conflict that could devastate the peaceful valley where the tribe lived. Jake volunteered to join the pursuit party, despite knowing that he would be entering combat alongside Apache warriors against other Native Americans. The situation forced him to examine his own loyalties and decide where he truly belonged. "You do not have to prove yourself in battle," Ayanna told him as the warriors prepared to leave. "You have already shown your worth in many ways." But Jake felt compelled to contribute to defending the people who had given him a chance at life. "If I am to be part of this tribe, then I must share its dangers as well as its benefits," he replied. The pursuit lasted 3 days through treacherous terrain. Jake's tracking skills, combined with his knowledge of cowboy tactics, proved valuable in locating the Comanche raiders. When they finally caught up with the war party, Jake fought alongside his Apache companions with skill and courage. During the battle, he saved the life of Crow Feather, the master tracker who had taught him so much. When a Comanche warrior's lance was aimed at Crow Feather's back, Jake intervened without hesitation, taking a serious wound to his shoulder in the process. The Apache warriors were deeply moved by Jake's willingness to risk his life for one of their own. When they returned to the village with the stolen horses recovered and the threat eliminated, the story of Jake's courage spread quickly throughout the tribe. As the season drew to a close, Chief Running Bear called for another tribal gathering to determine Jake's final fate. This time, the atmosphere was very different from the tense trial that had marked his arrival. Many tribe members who had initially opposed him now spoke in his favor. "This man has proven himself in battle and in daily life," declared Crow Feather, his arm still healing from the wound Jake had helped him avoid. "He fights for us, as if he were born Apache." Gray Wolf, the elder warrior who had taught Jake fighting techniques, added his support. "He learns our ways not to mock them or exploit them, but to become truly one of us. This is rare among any people, but especially among the white men." Even some who had remained skeptical admitted that Jake had exceeded their expectations. The scarred warrior who had initially argued for his execution now spoke grudgingly of his respect for the cowboy's dedication and courage. Grandmother Nilnish rose slowly from her place among the council members. Her voice, though soft with age, carried clearly across the gathering. "The spirits spoke truly when they showed me the vision of joined hearts. This man and our daughter Ayana have proven that understanding between peoples is possible." Chief Running Bear looked around at his tribe, seeing the remarkable transformation that had occurred over the past 3 months. Jake Morrison was no longer the trespasser who had stumbled into their sacred lands. Through his own efforts and the patient teaching of his daughter, he had become something unprecedented. "Jake Morrison," the chief said formally, "you began this season as a condemned man facing death for violating our sacred places. You chose the trial of understanding, and for 3 months, you have lived among us, learned our ways, and proven your character." The chief paused, his eyes moving from Jake to Ayana and back again. "The council has deliberated and we have reached our decision. You have earned the right to hear an offer that has never been made to a white man in the memory of our people." Jake felt his heart racing as he waited to learn his fate. Beside him, Ayana stood straight and calm, but he could see the tension in her eyes. "We offer you adoption into our tribe as a full member," Chief Running Bear announced. "You would become Apache in every way that matters, with all the rights and responsibilities that such membership entails. You would take an Apache name and be considered a son of this tribe for all your days." The crowd stirred with excitement at this unprecedented offer. Jake was overwhelmed by the honor being extended to him, but he knew there was more to consider than just his own desires. "What of Ayana?" he asked. "Her fate has been bound to mine throughout this trial." Chief Running Bear smiled for the first time since Jake had known him. "If you accept adoption into our tribe, and if Ayana consents, you would be free to marry according to our customs. She has proven herself worthy through her courage in defending you and her skill in teaching our ways." Jake turned to look at Ayana, seeing in her eyes the answer he hoped for. She stepped closer to him and spoke clearly so the entire tribe could hear. "Father," she said, addressing Chief Running Bear, "I accept the binding of our fates not as a burden imposed by tradition, but as a choice I make freely. This man has shown me that bridges can be built between our peoples through understanding and respect." Jake felt as if his heart might burst with joy and gratitude. In the space of 3 months, he had gone from a condemned trespasser to a welcomed member of the Apache tribe, with the prospect of marrying the most remarkable woman he had ever known. "I accept your offer with profound gratitude and humility," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will strive every day to be worthy of the trust you have placed in me." Chief Running Bear raised his staff one final time. "Then let it be so. From this day forward, you will be known as Running Horse, for you have traveled far and fast to reach understanding. Welcome to your new family, my son." As the tribe erupted in celebration, Jake felt Ayana's hand slip into his. He looked down at their joined hands, remembering grandmother Nalnish's vision of two hearts beating as one. In saving his life through her courageous words at his trial, Ayana had spoken the 4 words that changed everything. "I ask permission to speak." Those simple words had set in motion a chain of events that transformed not just Jake's fate, but the relationship between two very different worlds. Through understanding, respect, and love, barriers that had seemed impossible to cross had been overcome. As Running Horse began his new life as an Apache warrior and husband, he carried with him the knowledge that change was possible when people were willing to listen, learn, and open their hearts to different ways of seeing the world. The cowboy who had stumbled into sacred Apache lands was gone forever, replaced by a bridge between cultures that would strengthen both peoples for generations to come. Years later, when other white men would ask Running Horse about his life among the Apache, he would tell them about the power of respect, the importance of listening, and the courage required to truly understand those who seem different from ourselves. And he would always remember that it all began with a chief's daughter who was brave enough to speak 4 words that changed his fate forever. "I ask permission to speak."